They said she was too fat to be a bride. They said it at the general store, at the church steps, at every table in every saloon from one end of Red Hollow to the other. Mara Boone had heard it so many times the words had worn grooves into her like water-cutting stone. But on the morning Colt Mercer, the most powerful rancher in the territory, stood up in front of the entire town and said her name as the woman he intended to marry, the laughter stopped, and something uglier took its place. If you've ever been told you don't deserve the life you're reaching for, stay with me. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The first snow of November came early to Red Hollow, dropping overnight without warning the way bad news always did. Sudden, silent, and heavy enough to buckle the unprepared. Mara Boone was already awake before the snow started. She had been awake since 4 in the morning, same as every other morning, pulling on her wool coat and her second pair of socks and stepping out into the dark while the rest of the town was still dreaming. The lantern on the Boone porch threw a pale circle of light across the yard, and she moved through it quickly, her breath clouding in the cold air, her boots crunching frost-stiffened grass as she crossed to the small barn behind the house. The Hendersons' horse had a foot problem she'd offered to check on 2 days ago, and nobody had gotten around to it since. So here she was. That was more or less how most of Mara's mornings went. She was 31 years old and had lived in Red Hollow her entire life. She knew the land the way you know the face of someone you've looked at every day. Not perfectly, not without blind spots, but deeply and honestly, down to the places other people missed. She knew which wells ran dry in July and which held through August. She knew the ridge north of the Callaway spread where the wind changed direction in ways that meant weather was coming. She knew the creeks, the gullies, the patches of ground that looked solid but weren't, and the ones that looked rough but would carry weight without complaint. She also knew what the people of Red Hollow thought of her, because they were not particularly shy about saying it. She was a big woman. Not merely heavy, she was large in a way that left no ambiguity, the kind of body that filled a doorframe and took up its fair share of a wagon bench and did not apologize for existing. She had her mother's dark hair, thick and coarse, that she wore in a braid down her back most days because there was no point fussing over it when she had work to do. Her hands were roughened from outdoor labor. Her face was broad and plain, with brown eyes that missed very little and a mouth that defaulted to a patient expression she'd spent years practicing. She was not pretty. She knew this. The town had made sure she knew it. The comments had started when she was maybe 12, 13, the age when girls in small frontier towns started getting measured against some invisible standard of marriageability that Mara had never quite understood the logic of. Too big, too plain, too much. By the time she was 18, the verdict from Red Hollow's social court had more or less been delivered. Mara Boone was the kind of woman who helped other people build their lives, not the kind who built one of her own. She'd spent a long time being angry about that. Then she'd spent a long time pretending it didn't bother her. Now at 31, she had arrived somewhere quieter. Not acceptance exactly, more like a tired practicality. The town was going to think what it thought. She had work to do. She finished with the Henderson horse as the sky went from black to gray, and by the time she came back inside to start the stove, her mother was up. Clara Boone was 63 and moved like a woman 10 years older, her joints announcing every change in weather with the reliability of a barometer. She'd been a widow for 16 years and had kept the Boone property running through sheer stubbornness, with Mara's help in every season. The two of them were the entirety of the Boone household, and they had learned to exist in the specific, efficient silence of people who know each other's habits completely. "Snow's gonna stick," Clara said, without looking out the window. "Already an inch on the fence posts." Mara put the kettle on. "I want to ride out to the Patton place today. Heard their youngest came down sick and Ellen's been dealing with the cattle alone." Her mother gave her a look, not unkind, more assessing. "You just checked their water line last Thursday." "I know." "Mara." "She's managing 60 head by herself with a sick child in the house, Mama." Clara sat down at the table and said nothing for a moment, then, "Put some biscuits in a cloth for them. Don't go empty-handed or Ellen will feel like charity." "I know," Mara said again, and cracked eggs into the skillet. The town of Red Hollow had been founded 22 years ago by a cluster of families who'd decided that the particular valley where two unreliable creeks met was as good a place as any to stop moving west. It was not a rich town. It was not a beautiful town. It was the kind of place that existed because frontier life required places like it. A general store, a livery, a saloon, a doctor who was also the dentist, a schoolhouse that doubled as a meeting hall when necessary, and a collection of homes and ranches spread out across the valley floor and up into the foothills. The ranching families ran the valley's economy and most of its social architecture, which meant the ranching families ran Red Hollow. And at the top of that particular structure, by virtue of land holdings, cattle numbers, and the particular combination of competence and controlled temperament that tended to accumulate authority on the frontier, sat the Mercer Ranch. Colt Mercer was 38. He'd inherited the property from his father at 24 when the older man died of a fever, which meant he'd been running a significant cattle operation for 14 years, with the constant low-grade pressure that came from being the person everyone looked to when things went wrong. He was tall, lean in the way that outdoor work made a man lean, with dark hair shot through with early gray at the temples, and a face that had been weathered into a kind of permanent unreadability. He wasn't unfriendly. He wasn't warm either. He was simply a man who had learned to keep most of what he thought to himself, because on the frontier, showing uncertainty was often just as costly as feeling it. He had never married. This was the great ongoing mystery of Red Hollow's social life, a puzzle that a significant portion of the town's eligible daughters and their mothers had spent years attempting to solve. He was wealthy by local standards, land-rich, respected, not unkind. There was no obvious reason he should be alone, several very obvious reasons he should not be. And yet the years passed, and Colt Mercer remained unmarried, and the speculation about why never quite went quiet. Mara had a theory which she kept to herself. Colt Mercer was a man who did not do things until he was ready to do them, and he had simply not been ready. This was not complicated. Most of the town's theories were more interesting and involved scandal or secret grief or some flaw of character carefully hidden. Mara thought the simpler explanation was probably right. She had known Colt Mercer the way you know everyone in a small town, by sight, by reputation, by occasional encounter at the store or the livery or the spaces where ranching business happened. They were not friends. They were not enemies. They occupied the same community without occupying the same world, which was simply how it was between a man of his standing and a woman of hers. Or so she had always assumed. It was the Thursday before the first real freeze when she encountered him at the Patton fence line. She had ridden out with the biscuits, as promised, and spent 2 hours helping Ellen Patton move a portion of the herd to more sheltered pasture before the weather turned. Ellen's boy, 9 years old and miserable with a chest cold, had watched from the window. When Mara finally left, she took the eastern track back toward town because the creek crossing was better that way in wet weather, and that was how she came around the bend and found Colt Mercer's horse tied to a fence post and Colt himself crouching in the middle of the road, examining a wheel that had come half off a supply wagon. She pulled up. He looked up. "Morning," she said. "Morning." He stood, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Wheel pin sheared. I've got a spare, but I can't hold the axle and fit it at the same time." She looked at the wagon. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything about whether or not she was going to help. It was simply obvious that she would, so they got to it. It took about 15 minutes. She held the axle while he fitted and pinned the wheel, and it was awkward and cold, and at one point the wagon shifted and she had to brace her whole weight against the frame, and he said, without commentary, "Hold it. There. Got it." And the pin seated and the job was done. He checked the wheel 3 times before he was satisfied. She recognized the habit, the kind of compulsive verification that came from running an operation where a small failure could cascade into a large one. "Thank you," he said. He wasn't a man who embellished things. "On my way anyway," she said, which was close enough to true. She started to turn her horse, and he said, "You've been helping the Pattons." It wasn't a question. She looked back. Ellen's short-handed. "I know it." He paused. "You helped the Garver family last spring, too, with the irrigation work." They needed help. Most people watch their neighbors need help and figure it'll work itself out. She didn't have a response to that wouldn't sound like she was angling for something, so she just said, "I grew up here. These families grew up here. It matters." And then she rode on. She turned it over in her mind on the ride back to town. Not the conversation specifically, but the quality of his attention during it. He had looked at her the way people looked at things they were actually thinking about, not measuring her against some scale of appearance or social value. Just looking. She told herself it meant nothing, and mostly believed it. That a month passed. November settled in, gray and cold and earnest about it. Mara continued her rounds, the Patton place, the Garver family, old Walt Briggs on the North Pasture, whose hands had gotten bad enough that he struggled to do close work, the widow Marsh, who had no cattle left but kept chickens and needed help reinforcing the coop against what was shaping up to be a hard winter. The town noticed. The town had always noticed. The noticing did not translate into gratitude in any direct sense, more into a kind of settled assumption that Mara Boone was the person you could count on to step in when things got difficult. People accepted her help the way they accepted the weather, as something that arrived when you needed it, sourced from somewhere you didn't think too hard about. At the general store one Saturday, she overheard Patrice Aldrin talking to her daughter behind the dry goods shelf. Patrice ran the town's most active social network from the position of being married to the man who owned the store, which gave her a front row seat to everyone's business. "Still can't figure why she bothers," Patrice was saying. "Nobody's ever going to marry her, so it's not like she's building up some reputation for a future." "Maybe she just likes helping," the daughter said. A pause. "Mara Boone is 31 years old, Eleanor. She looks the way she looks. That ship has sailed, sunk, and rusted to the bottom. Some people make peace with their situation. That's all this is." Mara picked up the salt she'd come for and put it on the counter. Patrice came around from the shelf and did not flush or stumble or look away. She simply smiled the careful smile of someone who has not quite registered that they've been overheard. "Mara, cold enough for you?" "Getting there," Mara said, and counted out her coins. Chum. The town meeting in December was held for the purpose of discussing the upcoming winter water allocation. A boring and necessary argument about creek access that happened every year and resolved the same way it always did, with the biggest landholders getting the most access and everybody else negotiating the margins. Mara went because she went to all the town meetings. She sat near the back, which was where she always sat, and watched the men at the front table debate access rights to a creek that had been argued over for 20 years. Colt Mercer was at the front table. He was always at the front table. She noticed, because she was paying attention to the water discussion specifically, that he said less than the other ranchers, but that the room went quieter when he did speak. He had that quality. Not loudness, just weight. When Colt Mercer said something, people felt like they ought to listen. Halfway through the meeting, during a particularly circular argument between two of the smaller ranchers about fence line positioning, she saw him look across the room, not at the arguing men, at her. She didn't look away immediately because she was not a woman who flinched from eye contact. He held it for a moment. Then his attention went back to the argument, and she went back to thinking about water allocation, and the meeting eventually ended the way it always did, with most things unresolved and everyone promising to continue the conversation. She was putting on her coat to leave when he came up beside her. "You know the watershed north of the Callaway spread," he said. "Reasonably well. I've heard you mention the springs up there before." To Walt Briggs. She looked at him. "The man needs new conversation topics. He said you told him once there were 3 separate springs above the ridge that most people didn't know about, that they ran year-round." "They do. They run cold and they're hard to reach, but they run." Colt was quiet for a moment. He had the look he'd had by the wagon. Genuine attention, working something out. "If this winter goes the way the signs suggest it might, those springs could matter." "I've been thinking the same thing," she said. "Then we should talk about it." They did not talk about it that night. The room was thinning, and it was not the place for a proper conversation, but he said he'd stop by the Boone property that week, and she said all right, and they parted ways, and she rode home in the cold with something she couldn't quite name sitting in her chest, uncomfortable and bright. He came on a Tuesday, in the late afternoon, when the light was going the color of brass over the hills. Clara watched from the window with a carefully neutral expression while Mara let Colt in and sat him at the kitchen table, which felt strangely formal. A man of his standing in the Boone kitchen, in a chair that had a loose back leg she'd been meaning to fix since October. They talked about the springs for the better part of an hour. Mara spread out the rough map she'd drawn years ago from memory and exploration, marking the locations of the springs, the routes that could be taken by cattle if conditions forced it, the limitations. He asked questions that were specific and practical, and she answered them, and gradually the conversation moved from the springs to the larger question of what a sustained drought would mean for the valley if one came. "You know this land better than anyone I've talked to," he said at some point. He said it plainly, without the slight edge of surprise that most men put on a statement like that when speaking to a woman. "I've had years to learn it. The other ranchers, they don't know about the springs. Some of them do. They just haven't thought through what it would take to use them. You have." "I think about it," she said, "when I have trouble sleeping." He looked at her with that particular focus he had, and she felt it. The weight of being actually seen, not evaluated, not assessed for social value, just seen. She did not know what to do with it. "I want to talk to you again," he said, "about this, and about the valley, about what you know." "You're welcome to," she said, "because what else do you say to that?" He came back the following week, and the week after. By February, the conversations had shifted. They still talked about the land and the cattle and the water situation, which was worsening in ways that only the most attentive observers had noticed yet. But they had also, gradually, without either of them making a particular decision about it, started talking about other things. His father, her mother, what it meant to build something that lasted, what it cost to be the person people relied on. He was not an easy man to talk to, in the sense that he did not fill silences with noise or make conversation as a performance. But she was not an easy woman to talk to either, in the sense that she said what she thought and did not soften it for social comfort. And somehow those two particular difficulties canceled each other out, rather than compounding. They talked like people who were used to being misunderstood and had stopped being careful about it. She did not let herself think about what any of it meant. She thought about what it meant constantly. In March, on a clear, cold day, when the ground was still hard, but the sky had that quality of light that suggested spring was at least considering its options, Colt Mercer rode into Red Hollow on a Saturday morning and went to the front of the general store, where a cluster of ranchers and townspeople had gathered for the regular informal exchange of news and complaints that functioned as the town's social center. He asked them to hear something. Mara was not there. She was at home, mending a fence post at the back of the property, when the Henderson boy came pelting up the road on foot, out of breath, eyes huge. "Miss Boone," he gasped. "Mr. Mercer. He's in town. He said your name." She put down her tools. By the time she got to the general store, the crowd had grown. Word traveled fast in a small town, and what had happened was too extraordinary to contain. People had come out of the barber shop, out of the saloon, out of their homes down the street to stand in the cold and process what Colt Mercer had apparently just said in public, in front of witnesses, without a trace of uncertainty. He had said he intended to marry Mara Boone. He had not said it as an apology or a defense. He had said it the way he said everything, flatly, with the quiet sureness of a man who has made a decision and does not require the room's approval to proceed. He had said it was his intention to ask her formally, but he'd be damned if he'd let the town hear about it through gossip before she had a chance to know he meant it. Mara walked through the edge of the crowd, which parted in a way that was less about respect and more about the collective need to observe what was happening, and found Colt standing near the store steps. He was watching her come. He did not look nervous exactly. He looked like a man who has done a thing and is committed to whatever follows. The crowd was so quiet she could hear the wind. "I should have talked to you first," he said when she was close enough to hear. "Yes," she said, "you should have. I'm asking if you'll have me." She was aware of every eye on her. She was aware of Patrice Aldrin standing 15 feet away with an expression that had not yet decided what to be. She was aware of the Henderson boy, still red-faced from running. She was aware of the loose button on Colt's coat and the way his jaw was set, and the fact that her hands were dirty from fence work, and she had not planned for any of this. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. "I need to think about it," she said. If he was surprised, he didn't show it. He nodded once, the way he nodded when a thing made sense, and said, Take the time you need." She walked home. She did not look at the crowd. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of people beginning to talk, the low rising noise of a community processing an unexpected thing, and she walked away from it with her chin level and her hands in her coat pockets and her heart making a racket in her chest that she hoped nobody could hear. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time while her mother made tea and did not say anything. "Well," Clara finally said, "I'm thinking, he's a good man." "I know he is." "Then what are you thinking about?" Mara looked at her hands, the roughness of them. The dirt still worked into the knuckles she hadn't quite scrubbed out. "I'm thinking about whether a good man's choice is enough to change what this town has already decided about me," she said. "And I'm thinking about what happens when it doesn't." Her mother set 2 cups of tea on the table and sat down. "It doesn't change what they've decided," Clara said. "You know that. They'll say terrible things." "I know." "And?" Mara wrapped both hands around the cup. Outside, the March light was going thin and pale across the frozen yard, catching the frost on the fence posts she'd been repairing, the one she'd been fixing on her own for 16 years, because that was what you did when you were Mara Boone. And the world had given you a particular kind of life, and you had decided, somewhere along the way, that you were going to live it all the way through, rather than standing at the edge of it and watching. "And I'm going to say yes," she said. She did. The wedding was small and functional and held on a Tuesday, which was not a traditional wedding day, which suited Mara perfectly. Clara cried. Walt Briggs attended and shook Colt's hand for a very long time without speaking. The Henderson family came. Ellen Patton came with her boy, who was fully recovered and entirely fascinated by the whole proceeding. Most of Red Hollow did not come. This was expected. What was also expected, though it arrived faster than Mara had anticipated, the noise. It began the same week, a low, persistent drumbeat of comment and speculation that moved through the town's social channels with the efficiency of water finding its level. She heard fragments of it everywhere, at the store, at the well, carried back to her by people who were either trying to warn her or, less charitably, trying to observe her reaction. She'd manipulated him. She'd tricked him somehow. She'd gotten pregnant. This one made her laugh out loud, alone, in the barn. Or had some leverage over him, some information about his finances or his past that she was using to force his hand. No one could accept the obvious explanation, which was simply that Colt Mercer had made a choice, and it was his to make. Some of it found her directly. At the dry goods counter one afternoon, 2 weeks after the wedding, the wife of one of Colt's business partners looked at Mara's hand on the counter, the plain ring, the work-roughened knuckles, and said, in a voice that was not bothering to be quiet, "He'll come to his senses. Men always do." Mara looked at the woman for a moment. Then she picked up her parcel and said, "Have a good day, Mrs. Foster," and walked out. That night she stood at the bedroom window of the Mercer Ranch house, her house now, a thought that still arrived with a kind of low shock, and looked out at the land in the dark. It was vast. It was quiet. It asked nothing of her except competence and endurance, which were 2 things she had in abundance. She could hear Colt in the other room, going through the ranch accounts, the scratch of his pen, the occasional quiet sound of a man working. She thought, this is the thing they can't account for. Not the ring, not the land, not any of the social mathematics they're using to explain what happened. They can't account for the fact that Colt Mercer had sat at her kitchen table all winter and talked to her like a person, and had listened to what she knew, and had decided on the basis of actual evidence that she was someone worth choosing. The town could not hold that thought. It did not fit the story they had built about her. Well, she thought, stories can be rebuilt. She moved away from the window and went to sit beside him at the table where the accounts were spread, and she picked up the second ledger and started checking his columns. And he looked over and said nothing, just moved the lamp closer so she could see better. Outside, the last of the winter dark lay across the valley, and somewhere to the north, hidden above the ridge, the mountain springs were running cold and steady and patient, the way they always had, waiting for the season that would make them matter. The sabotage started small, the way most cruelty does. First, it was the fence line on the east pasture, 3 sections down, the posts pulled clean from the ground and stacked nearby with enough deliberateness to rule out wind or cattle pressure. Colt found it on a Monday morning in early April, and stood looking at it for a while before he said anything. He walked the line, checked the posts, looked at the ground. The soil around the bases had been disturbed recently. Someone had used a pry bar. He told Mara that evening. She was at the stove and she turned and looked at him and said, "The east pasture. That's the one that borders the Aldrin property." "Yes." "Did you talk to Aldrin?" "Not yet." "What are you waiting for?" He set his hat on the table. "To be sure about what I'm saying before I say it." This was, she had come to understand in the 2 months since the wedding, simply how Colt operated. He was not a slow thinker. His mind was quick and precise when it needed to be. But he had an almost constitutional reluctance to act on incomplete information. He would rather wait too long than move too fast and be wrong. She had told him once that this quality was occasionally maddening, and he had said, "Probably," without any apparent distress. "Fix the fence," she said. "Note the date. If it happens again, you'll have a pattern." It happened again, 11 days later. Different section, same method. Around the same time, Colt lost 2 business agreements he'd held for years. The first was a supply contract with a cattle broker in the next county. The broker sent a letter that was politely worded and said nothing specific except that he was consolidating his arrangements with other suppliers, which was the kind of language people used when the real reason was something they didn't want written down. The second was a handshake agreement with a neighboring rancher named Dorset about shared use of a northern road that crossed both properties. Dorset sent his son to deliver the news in person, which was at least a gesture of some decency, but the son was 17 and clearly uncomfortable and couldn't explain the actual reasoning beyond, "Pa said things have changed." Mara was the reason. She understood this before Colt said it, and before the evidence made it undeniable. The marriage had disrupted something, not just hurt feelings or wounded pride, though there was plenty of that. It had disrupted the social ledger that the valley's ranching families kept. The invisible accounting of who owed what to whom, who was connected to whom, what alliances held. Colt Mercer had been an asset in other men's calculations. A wealthy, unmarried rancher with no particular loyalties of the heart was a resource for potential marriages, for favors sought and given, for the kind of social influence that moved quietly and depended on access. His marriage to Mara had closed a door that a number of people had been counting on staying open, and they were making him pay for it. She brought it up one night, directly, because she was not able to maintain the pretense that neither of them was thinking it. "They're doing this because of me," she said. He was reading by the fire. He didn't put the book down immediately, which meant he'd been expecting the conversation and was deciding how to enter it. Then he closed the book and set it aside. "Some of them," he said. "Most of them." "Maybe." "Colt." He looked at her. "What do you want me to say, Mara? That it's happening? Yes. That I didn't see it coming? No, I saw it coming. That I'm going to pretend I didn't know what I was walking into when I married you?" He paused. "I'm not that stupid, and you're not that fragile." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not fragile. I just want to know we're looking at the same problem. We're looking at the same problem. And I didn't marry you because the town approved of it. So the town disapproving of it doesn't change a great deal from my perspective." She wanted to say, "It changes the ranch. It changes the accounts. It changes the hands who won't come to work for you now because their fathers told them not to." She wanted to lay out the full ledger of what his choice was costing him and ask him whether he'd calculated it properly. Instead, she said, "The Dorset Road access mattered." "It did." "We'll need another route for the Northwest cattle come summer." "I know." "The creek crossing near the Fuller property is usable if it doesn't flood." "I've ridden it. It'll hold." She nodded. He picked his book back up, and she went back to the mending she'd been doing, and neither of them said anything else for a while. But the thing between them, the thing that had been building since the first frozen Tuesday at her kitchen table, it held. She could feel it the way you feel solid ground after a period of uncertain footing. Not comfort, exactly. Something more durable than comfort. The hands were the next problem. The Mercer Ranch employed 6 men in the regular season and brought in additional help during branding and roundup. By May, 2 of the regulars had quit, not rudely, not with any stated grievance about Mara specifically, but in the way of men who have been talked to by their families and their neighbors and have decided that the social cost of association is too high. One of them, a young man named Pete Greer, who'd worked the ranch for 3 years, had the decency to tell Colt directly that his father had given him an ultimatum. "I'm sorry, Mr. Mercer," Pete said. He meant it. He was standing in the yard with his hat in his hands, genuinely uncomfortable. "It's just, my pa says the Aldrin family's been talking. Says working here now is that it looks bad." "Looks bad," Colt said. "I know it's not right. I got family, sir." "I know you do, Pete. You go ahead." Colt told Mara about it that evening in approximately 4 sentences. She listened, and then she said, "I can help with the morning cattle until you find someone." "Mara, I know how to work cattle. You know I know." "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" He was quiet for a moment, and she watched the thing he was working against. Not pride exactly, more a kind of fierce private reluctance to let the circumstances push the terms of their marriage into something neither of them had intended. He had not married a ranch hand. She had not agreed to become one, but the ranch needed labor and they both knew it, and the choice was between her help and going without. "All right," he said finally. "Don't look like I just told you bad news." "I don't." "You do. You look like someone just handed you a debt you didn't want." He looked at her for a long moment. "I look like a man who wanted better circumstances for his wife than this." The honest plainness of it stopped her. She sat with it for a moment. The unexpected weight of being considered, of having someone speak directly to what her life deserved rather than what it was. "Well," she said after a moment, "the circumstances are what they are. We work with what we've got." Oh, she was good with cattle, better than Pete Greer had been, which she noticed without saying. She'd grown up working alongside ranching families and had an instinct for the work that was separate from any formal training, a feel for how cattle moved, how they thought in their limited way, when pressure was working and when it was making things worse. The 2 remaining hands, brothers named Cal and Ray Donette, watched her for the first week with the careful, neutral expressions of men trying not to have a visible opinion. By the second week, Cal had started pointing out things that needed doing without being asked. By the third week, Ray had shown her the shortcut around the south pasture that saved 40 minutes on the morning check. None of this was friendship. It was working tolerance, which was a reasonable starting point. The Dunnett brothers were also, she came to understand, a source of information. Not because they gossiped, they didn't particularly, but because they moved through the same social world as the other ranching hands and knew what was being said in the circles where men talked about the valley's business. It was Ray who told her in mid-May that she should know there was talk about the water. "What kind of talk?" she said. They were mending a section of fence at the western boundary, a job that moved slowly and produced long stretches of nothing to do but talk. "The Aldrins," Ray said, not looking at her. "Word is they've been having conversations with some of the other families about the creek allocation, about whether there's a case to be made for adjusting the terms come summer." She looked at him. "Adjusting them how?" "Reducing the Mercer allotment, claiming the original survey was inaccurate." She set down the wire stretcher. "That survey's been the basis of the allocation for 15 years. "I know it." "Who else is in these conversations?" "Dorset, the Fosters, maybe the Calloway family. I'm not sure on that one." She picked the wire stretcher back up and worked the next section in silence. Ray and Cal exchanged a glance over her head, which she registered but didn't address. "Thank you," she said when the section was done. "For telling me." Ray shrugged. "Thought you should know." That night she laid it out for Colt at the kitchen table. The full shape of what Ray had described, the names, the likely legal mechanism they'd use to challenge the survey, the timeline if they moved on it. He listened without interrupting, which was how he always listened, and when she was done, he sat quietly for a moment. "They can't actually win a survey challenge," he said. "The original boundaries are documented. They don't need to win. They need to drag it into dispute for long enough to affect this summer's allocation. If the creek gets tied up in a legal argument while we're in the dry season, the cattle go without reliable water." He said it quietly. "And then we're buying water we shouldn't have to buy, or moving cattle to ground that wasn't planned for it, or both." She paused. "This isn't random, Colt. The fence line, the lost contracts, Pete Greer, and now the water survey. It's one thing. He looked at her. You think someone's coordinating it? I think the Aldrins have been very busy since March. The name sat between them. Dale Aldrin, Patrice's husband, the general store owner, was not a man given to open confrontation. He was the other kind. Patient, methodical, working through the social machinery of a small town with the practiced ease of someone who had spent 20 years learning its mechanisms. His daughter had been, according to the town's general understanding, one of the more serious candidates for Colt's eventual choice of wife. Mara had never paid much attention to this. It had not seemed relevant to her life, but it was very relevant now. He's going to keep going, she said, until you sell or fail or... She stopped. Or what? She looked at him steadily. Or until you make a choice that separates you from me. He held her gaze. Then he's going to keep going a long time. She appreciated the directness. She also did not let herself rely on it entirely because she understood, more clearly perhaps than Colt did, because she had grown up understanding the economics of social rejection in a way he hadn't needed to, that there was a limit to what principle could absorb before it started costing things that couldn't be paid back. We need to file a preemptive response to the survey challenge, she said, before they move officially. If your attorney documents the existing boundaries with a second survey now, they lose the legal lever. That costs money. Less than a summer dispute over water allocation. He thought about it. Who do you know that could do a second survey quickly? There's a land surveyor in Millhaven. I dealt with him on the Garver property line issue last year. He's competent, and he's not connected to anyone here. All right. He stood up. I'll write out Thursday. She started stacking the papers she'd spread across the table. He was moving toward the door when he stopped and turned back and said, with the slightly effortful quality of a man who does not find this kind of speech easy, "You would have made a good partner for any ranch in this valley." She didn't look up from the papers. I know that. She heard him almost laugh. Not quite, more a sound at the edge of one. Then he was gone, and she sat alone with the lamp and the documents and the particular weight of a fight that wasn't over, wasn't close to over, but had the shape of something they might actually survive. But June arrived dry. Not the natural dry of a normal early summer, but something that felt different, heavier, more committed. The creek that fed the valley's south pastures dropped a foot below its usual level before the month was half done. The grass went brittle earlier than anyone could remember. The old-timers who had seen bad years shook their heads and said things that the younger ranchers tried to hear as exaggeration. Mara noticed the land the way she always had, the specific and particular way of a person who had spent years paying attention to things without any expectation of reward for the pain. The soil near the eastern pasture creek banks had a quality she hadn't seen in years. The insects were moving differently. The cattle themselves were off. Not sick, just restless. The low-grade agitation of animals that can sense before people can that something is coming. She mentioned it to Colt on a Thursday evening while they were going over the water accounts she'd started keeping. I think we need to start planning for the springs, she said. He looked up from the ledger. It's June. I know. Most years we don't start talking about the mountain springs until August at the earliest. Most years the South Creek isn't this low in June. She showed him the columns she'd been keeping, the creek measurements she'd been taking every 3 days since April, the comparison with the 2 previous drought years she could find records for. The numbers were not good. He studied the columns for a long time. How long would it take to open a route to the first spring, he said, working steadily? Maybe 3 weeks to clear and mark the trail well enough for cattle. Longer if the terrain's harder than I remember above the second ridge. We'd need more hands. We'd need at least 2 more, yes. He closed the ledger. I'll see who will work here. Which was its own problem. They both knew it, because the social pressure that had taken Pete Greer and the others had not lessened. It had, if anything, thickened as the months passed and the Aldrin's quiet campaign continued. The survey challenge had been filed anyway in late May, a week after Colt's documentation was submitted, and it was sitting in a county office now being argued by lawyers who cost money while the summer moved forward without asking anyone's permission. Mara looked at the map of the springs. She had drawn this map and added to it, and corrected it over a decade of walking that ground for no reason beyond wanting to know what was there. Nobody had asked her to. Nobody had thanked her for it. She had done it because the land seemed worth knowing. Now the map was going to matter in ways she hadn't anticipated. She could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives. Not certain, not comfortable, just present, like a pressure change in the air that you can't quite name but absolutely cannot ignore. Outside, the evening light was going golden and dry over the valley. Not a cloud anywhere. She folded the map carefully and put it in the front of the ledger where it could be found fast. The two new hands Colt found were not ideal, which was the most honest way to put it. One was a man named Hicks, who had worked 3 different ranches in the past 2 years and had a reputation for doing the job adequately and leaving before anyone could form a strong opinion of him. The other was barely a man at all, 17 years old, the youngest son of a family that had come through Red Hollow heading somewhere else and run out of money, going by the name of Thomas. He was willing and not stupid, but he had the raw, unfinished quality of someone who had not yet learned how his own body worked, which made him useful for simple tasks and a liability for complicated ones. These were the men available to work the Mercer Ranch in July. Everyone else had either declined outright or found themselves suddenly too busy when Colt came asking. He didn't tell Mara how many people he'd approached before landing on Hicks and the boy. She didn't ask. The trail work to the first spring took 4 weeks instead of 3. The terrain above the second ridge was harder than Mara's memory of it. A rock slide sometime in the past few years had shifted the most direct approach, and they had to cut a longer route around it that added a 1/4 mile and a significant elevation change that was going to matter when cattle were tired and thirsty. She walked it herself 3 times, marking the path with cairns, noting the places where the ground went soft or the grade steepened too sharply. Colt rode it once and didn't say anything critical, which meant he thought it would hold. By the last week of July, the South Creek was down to a trickle in 2 of its 3 channels. The wells across the valley were dropping. The ranchers who had dismissed the early signs in June were not dismissing anything anymore. At a gathering outside the general store, not a formal town meeting, just the kind of loose, urgent congregation that forms when people are scared and need to be near other scared people, Mara watched Dale Aldrin hold court from the store steps, speaking in the measured tone of a man performing calm for an audience that was not calm. "What we need," Aldrin was saying, "is a coordinated approach to the county water authority. A formal petition for emergency allocation from the upstream reserves." Somebody, she thought it was the Fuller boy, called out, "How long does that take?" "These things take time," Aldrin said, which was not an answer. "What do we do in the meantime? We conserve. We rotate grazing. We wait for the process to work." Mara was standing at the edge of the group with Colt. She felt him look at her sideways and did not return the look because she was watching Aldrin, and she was thinking about the springs, and she was doing the arithmetic on how long a formal petition to a county water authority would actually take versus how many days the valley's cattle could survive on current water levels. The numbers did not work. She raised her voice. "The petition process takes 8 to 12 weeks minimum. We don't have 8 weeks." The crowd turned. Aldrin looked at her with the expression of a man encountering a problem he'd hoped to avoid. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, in a tone that managed to be polite and dismissive simultaneously, "the formal process exists for a reason." "The formal process exists for normal conditions," she said. "These aren't normal conditions. By the time the county responds, we'll have lost cattle we can't replace. And what would you suggest instead?" "There are 3 springs above the North Ridge, year-round water, high volume. I know where they are, and I know how to reach them." The silence that followed was not the respectful kind. It was the kind that forms when a room is processing something unexpected and most of the room has already decided, before processing is complete, that it does not like what it's hearing. From somewhere in the middle of the crowd, a man named Garrett said, "You can't run cattle up that ridge. The terrain's too rough." "I've already cleared a trail." Another silence. "When?" someone said. "Past month. It's marked and passable." She looked around the group. "I'm not telling you it's easy. I'm telling you it exists and the water at the top is real, and it doesn't depend on what the county decides to do in 12 weeks. She could feel the resistance in the crowd. Not universal, but heavy. These were people who had spent months absorbing the social message that Mara Boone was someone to look down on, and being asked to look up to her plan was a demand they were not prepared for. Aldrin shook his head slowly. A rough trail to some mountain springs isn't a plan, Mrs. Mercer. It's an adventure story. A few people laughed, not many, but enough. She looked at Aldrin for a moment. All right, she said, and said nothing else, and stepped back. Colt beside her kept his face level. On the ride home, he said, You could have argued it harder. No, she said. I couldn't have. Not today. They're not ready to hear it from me. Then when? When they're scared enough that who's talking stops mattering. August came in like something with a grudge. The temperature climbed to levels that pressed on the body even before noon. The sky was the flat, white blue of bleached bone, without a cloud for days at a stretch. The remaining creek channels went to mud and then to nothing. The wells dropped so fast that a man checking one on a Monday might find it 3 feet lower by Friday. The cattle knew before the humans fully admitted it. They moved differently, tighter, restless, pressing toward any remembered water source and standing there even when the source was dry, as if waiting was a strategy. The older animals got quiet. The younger ones got agitated. Both were bad signs. Hicks quit on the 14th of August. He left before dawn on a Sunday without a word, taking his pay and leaving a 2-line note on the bunkhouse bench that said he had people in another county and was going to them. Thomas, the 17-year-old, found the note and brought it to Colt with the careful expression of a boy trying not to show that he was frightened. You don't have to stay, Colt told him. I don't have anywhere to go, Thomas said, which was honest in a way that was hard to argue with. Mara was running the morning cattle check on less than 6 hours of sleep, her neck sunburned and her boots coming apart at the left heel. She fixed the heel herself with rawhide and didn't mention it to anyone. There was a specific calculus in hard times about what problems were worth naming aloud, and a boot heel did not make the list. On the 16th, a Wednesday, the dust storm came. She had seen the signs in the morning, not a single specific thing, but a quality in the air, a stillness that was too complete. The way the cattle had bunched overnight without obvious cause, the color of the horizon to the southwest at first light, that was brown where it should have been gray. She told Colt at breakfast. How long? He said. Could be today, could be tonight. They spent the morning getting cattle into the most sheltered pasture they had, moving the ones that were already weakened from the heat into the barn, checking every gate and latch and hinge. Thomas worked without being asked, following Colt and then Mara through each task in sequence, which raised her opinion of him. The storm arrived in the mid-afternoon. It arrived the way frontier weather always did in her experience, without the slow warning you wanted, and with the sudden absolute commitment you dreaded. 1 hour the air was still and hot and unbearable. The next hour the sky to the southwest was a wall, brown-black and moving, so large it looked like a geographical feature rather than a weather event, a second horizon coming to replace the first. Mara was in the north pasture when she felt the temperature drop and looked up and said, out loud, to no one, There it is. She got back to the main buildings 10 minutes before it hit. Colt was closing the last barn door. Thomas was wedging the bunkhouse shutters. She went through the house front to back, checking windows, and she was closing the last one in the back bedroom when the storm hit the wall of the building like a physical force. It was loud in a way that was surprising, even knowing it was coming, a roaring, grinding sound that was not like wind exactly, more like the earth itself had come loose and was moving. The light outside the windows went from brown to dark inside of 3 minutes. She could hear debris striking the walls. She could feel the house move in small, unnerving ways. She sat in the hallway, which was the most sheltered interior point of the structure, and she thought about the cattle in the north pasture that they hadn't gotten to in time. And she thought about the trail to the springs and whether the storm was going to undo the cairns and the cleared sections. And she thought about the families across the valley who were in their own houses or barns or wherever they'd managed to get to in time. Colt came in through the front door at a run, got it shut and barred behind him. He was covered in dust, his face dark with it, except where he'd been squinting and the skin had creased. He sat against the hallway wall beside her, breathing hard. Thomas? Bunkhouse, he said. He's all right. The North Pasture cattle. Couldn't get to them. They'll find the low ground. She nodded. The storm pressed at the house with methodical persistence, and she sat with her back against the wall and her knees up and her hands still in her lap, and she let herself feel, for approximately 90 seconds, the full weight of how bad this was. The valley was already at the edge of what it could absorb. This storm was going to push what remained over it. Then she stopped feeling it and started thinking about the springs. The storm passed in 4 hours. The damage it left was not the dramatic kind. No buildings down, no fires. It was the grinding, comprehensive kind. Fences stripped or buried, wells fouled with dust and debris that would take days to clear, feed stores contaminated, animals found in the wrong places, 2 or 3 from the North Pasture gone entirely, maybe dead, maybe just moved to ground she hadn't checked yet. And everywhere the absolute confirmation that the valley's water situation was now beyond the management of patience and petitions. Word spread through the ranching families within 24 hours. Not organized communication, just the natural movement of desperate people toward one another, checking on neighbors, comparing damage, arriving at the same terrible arithmetic from different starting points. By Thursday morning, 2 days after the storm, a loose and frightened cluster of ranchers and their families had gathered in the yard of the Fuller property, which was more or less central, without anyone particularly organizing it. Mara and Colt rode in and tied their horses at the fence. She saw the faces turn toward them, some neutral, some hostile, most just exhausted and hollowed out in the way of people who have been managing fear for too long. Garrett was there, the Dorset boy. Ellen Patton, who had ridden in from the east with her son sitting in front of her on the saddle. Even Walt Briggs had made it, which meant he'd ridden on those bad hands and not complained about it. Maybe 40 people in total, not all of the valley's ranching families, but enough. Dale Aldrin was there, standing near the front. He looked tired in a way she had not seen him look before. The careful composure was fraying at the edges. He had been speaking when they arrived, and he continued for a few minutes more about the county petition, the water authority, the formal channels. She listened to all of it and watched the faces of the people listening to him, and she saw the specific hopelessness of people who need a solution and are being offered a process. When Aldrin paused, she spoke. "I want to talk about the springs," she said. The reaction was not as hostile as the last time. Some of it was the exhaustion. Some of it was the storm having done the work that argument couldn't. When enough has been stripped away, people sometimes stop caring where a good idea comes from, but some of the resistance was still there. Garrett shook his head and started to speak, and she kept going before he could. "I know the trail is rough. I know the elevation is hard on tired cattle. I know it's not a solution anyone would choose if there were another option." She looked around the group. "I also know that the first spring alone has more water than this valley has seen in 3 weeks. Year-round, gravity-fed. I have watched it since I was a girl, and it has never gone dry." "How many head could it support?" somebody asked. She thought it was the Dorset boy. The first spring, conservatively, could support 60 head rotating in and out over a 2-week period. The second spring is another 40. The third I haven't fully assessed, but it's the largest of the 3. "The trail," Garrett said. "You said yourself the grade is steep." "It is. We lose maybe 2 to 3 animals on the push-up. That's my honest estimate. We compare that to what we're already losing down here." The math of it landed visibly on several faces. Garrett looked at the ground. "Who knows the trail?" Ellen Patton said. She'd pushed her way toward the front, her boy still at her side. "You cleared it, Mara. You know it." "I know it." "Then you'd have to lead it." "I know that too." Ellen looked around the group. "I'm sending my cattle. I don't have a choice." She looked at Mara. "Tell me what I need to bring." A moment. One of those moments in a crowd where something tips, where the accumulated weight of individual decision reaches a point and the group moves. Not everyone moved. Aldrin stood with his arms crossed and his expression carefully blank. Garrett still looked uncertain. But Ellen Patton had said she was going, and Walt Briggs raised his hand with the slow deliberateness of a man whose opinion people had respected for 30 years, and said, "I'm in." Others followed. Not all of them. Maybe 2/3. Colt had been standing slightly behind her through all of it. Now he moved up beside her, and she felt it. The simple physical fact of him standing next to her in front of this crowd, which was itself a statement that required no words. "We leave Sunday morning," he said. "Be at the Mercer fence line by first light." People started talking to each other, to Mara, to Colt. The specific noise of people who have made a frightening decision and are now managing the logistics of it. Mara answered questions steadily. How much water to carry for the push? What to do with the weaker cattle? How long the drive to the first spring would take? She answered each question with the patient specificity of a woman who had been thinking about exactly these questions for months, alone, in the dark, without anyone asking. Aldrin left without speaking to her. She noticed, and then she let it go, because there was too much to do to spend attention on what Dale Aldrin thought of her. On the ride home, Colt said, 2/3. "It's enough," she said. "Dorsett didn't commit. Dorsett will follow when he sees the others moving. He always does." And Aldrin. She kept her eyes on the road ahead. The valley spread out around them, heat-bleached and dusty, the mountains to the north visible in the hard, clear air, the ridge above which the springs ran cold and steady and completely indifferent to the trouble happening below them. "Aldrin's going to have to make a choice," she said, "but that's his problem, not mine." She rode the rest of the way home thinking about Sunday, about the grade above the second ridge, about whether the cairns had held through the storm, about 40 years of watching her own life from the outside of things, and the strange, uncertain feeling of standing at the center of something for the first time, not because anyone had handed her a place there, but because she had built the knowledge, walked the ground, and stayed when it would have been easier to go. It did not feel triumphant. It felt like work, which was something she understood completely. Sunday came in gray and cool, which was the first mercy the valley had received from the sky in 6 weeks. Mara was at the Mercer fence line before first light, the way she'd said to be. She had slept 4 hours, which was enough, and had eaten something before she left the house, which Colt had insisted on with the specific quiet insistence he used for things he considered non-negotiable. The coffee had been hot, and the biscuits had been left from the day before and slightly hard, and she had eaten them standing at the kitchen counter while the dark outside the window went from black to the particular deep blue that came just before dawn. She had the map in her coat pocket, though she didn't need it. She had the route in her body at this point. Every grade change, every loose section, every place where the trail narrowed or the ground went uncertain. She had walked it enough times that she could have found the springs blind. The families started arriving at the fence line as the gray light built. Ellen Patton came first, with her boy and 63 head of cattle moving in a loose, unhappy cluster behind the horse. Then the Briggs family, Walt's 2 sons managing the herd since Walt himself was only going as far as the lower ridge before turning back, his hands not up to the full drive. The Garver family. 2 smaller operations she knew by face, but not well. By the time the light was enough to see clearly across the yard, there were approximately 220 cattle gathered at the Mercer fence line, and 14 people on horseback, and the 17-year-old Thomas on a horse that was too big for him, but that he was managing with the tense concentration of someone who has decided they are capable of a thing and is not going to be proven wrong. Dorsett showed up 15 minutes after the agreed time, with his son and 40 head. He tied his horse near Colt's without making eye contact with anyone, checked his cinch twice, and said nothing. Aldrin did not come. Mara did a count of people and animals, adjusted the plan she'd been running in her head, and rode to the front. "Listen," she said, loud enough, not louder. The group settled. The first hour is flat and manageable. The grade starts after the creek crossing, and it gets serious above the second ridge. Don't push the animals past what they'll give. A tired animal on that terrain will go down, and it will slow everyone behind it. If something goes wrong, stop and call out. Don't try to solve a problem quietly up there. She looked around the group. Questions. It wasn't phrased as a request for questions exactly, more a brief opening she offered before moving forward. A few people shook their heads. Ellen Patton said, "How long to the first spring?" "Best case, 4 hours from here. If we have problems, longer. Plan for 5. "All right." "Move when I move," Mara said, and turned her horse north. The first hour was manageable, as promised. The cattle moved with the reluctant cooperation of animals that are thirsty enough to follow the suggestion of forward momentum, even if they can't understand the destination. The ground was flat, and the trail was wide, and the gray sky kept the temperature down in a way that helped. People rode mostly in silence, conserving themselves as much as the animals, watching the terrain ahead where the hills began to rise against the sky. The creek crossing was shallow. The creek itself almost gone, more a wide stretch of damp sand than actual running water, which was its own kind of discouraging. The cattle picked through it with their heads down, sniffing at the wet sand, a few of them pawing at it as if water might be closer than it looked. Mara kept moving, and the herd followed. The grade started soft, the way a steep climb often does, gradual enough that you don't notice it until your horse is working harder than it should be and the flatland behind you has dropped away. By the time they reached what Mara thought of as the first bench, a wider section of trail roughly a third of the way up, 3 of the weaker cattle had started to labor, and she called a rest. 15 minutes. The animals spread out on the bench, and people climbed down and walked among them, checking condition, checking feet, moving the ones that needed to be at the front away from the ones that needed to be at the rear. Thomas was managing a cluster of the Mercer cattle with the focused attention of a young man who has found the specific work that wakes him up, and Mara watched him for a moment and thought that Colt should find a way to keep him on after this. Garrett pulled his horse up beside her during the rest. He was a big man, Garrett, broad across the shoulders, not quick to speak, the kind of frontier rancher who had built his opinion of himself through 30 years of physical competence and was not comfortable in situations where physical competence wasn't the relevant skill. She had watched him at the Fuller property, gathering dismiss her plan with the reflex confidence of a man who assumed he understood terrain better than she did. He looked at the trail above them. He looked at his cattle. Then he looked at her. "You've done this right," he said. It came out with the slight stiffness of a man who doesn't apologize easily, but has something adjacent to an apology that needs to come out. "The trail's holding," she said. She was not going to make it easy for him, but she was not going to make it hard either. There was too much left to climb. "I should have listened at the Fuller place." She looked at him directly. "You're here now." He nodded once and moved his horse back to his herd, and she let the moment be what it was, small, awkward, real, and turned her attention back to the trail. The section above the second ridge was as hard as she'd remembered, and harder than she'd described. The rockslide reroute added the quarter mile she'd warned about, and the elevation change was steep enough that the cattle moved up it in single file, heads down, the particular slow-heaving walk of large animals doing difficult work. The footing was uneven. The trail was as well cleared as she and Colt and Thomas had been able to make it, but cleared was not the same as good, and there were places where the animals had to step carefully around exposed rock faces that left no margin. One of Ellen Patton's cattle went down on the shale section, a middle-aged cow that had been flagging since the lower ridge. It happened suddenly, and with a sound, a sliding scrape, then the specific heavy impact of a large animal losing its footing. The cattle behind it stopped. The cow got partway up, found her footing bad, and went down again. Ellen was off her horse before Mara fully registered what had happened. She was at the cow's head, hands on the animal's neck, talking to it in the low, flat voice that ranching people use with animals in distress. Not soothing, exactly, more a constant signal of presence. The cow's legs were working, trying to find purchase that wasn't there. "Block behind her," Mara said to the 2 men nearest her. "Both sides, don't let her roll." She dismounted and moved up to the cow's hindquarters. "When I say, we push her forward and up, she needs to get her front legs under her first." She looked at Ellen. "Hold her head up." It took 4 minutes and was not graceful. The cow thrashed once and caught Mara across the left forearm with a hoof that was going to leave a bruise from wrist to elbow. She kept her grip and said nothing. When the animal finally lurched upright and stood shaking on the shale, there was a collective exhale from the people nearby that sounded like something loosening. Ellen checked the cow's legs with her hands, running down each one. "She'll walk," she said. "Keep her at the back of your group for the rest of the push," Mara said. Her arm hurt. She got back on her horse. They lost 2 animals on the upper section, one of the Garver cattle that simply lay down and would not get up, and one of Dorset's younger steers that missed a step on the sharpest corner of the reroute and went down the slope. Dorset watched the steer go down with his jaw set and his face the particular flat, careful expression of a man not letting himself react to a cost he cannot afford. Mara did not say anything to him. There was nothing useful to say. They reached the first spring at just past noon. The sound of it reached them before the spring itself was visible. Water moving over rock, thin and steady, the most unremarkable sound in the world, except when you have been living without it for weeks. The cattle heard it before the people did, and the herd's behavior changed immediately and completely. The labored, reluctant pace disappeared, and the animals surged forward with a single-minded urgency that nearly took out two of the riders in the front. Mara moved her horse wide and let them go. The spring was modest in appearance, a rock shelf where water came through a crack in the formation and ran down into a natural basin that was maybe 15 feet across. But it was running full and clean and cold, and 200 animals drank from it in shifts over the next 2 hours while people climbed down and sat on rocks or patches of thin grass and did not talk very much. Thomas sat near the water's edge and put his face in his hands for a moment, the specific gesture of a person releasing something they'd been holding for a long time. Then he straightened up and looked around to see if anyone had noticed, and Mara was the only one looking, and she turned away to give him the privacy of it. Colt came and stood beside her while the last of the cattle were drinking. He had a cut above his left eyebrow from a branch on the reroute section that he hadn't mentioned and apparently wasn't going to mention. "Too lost?" he said. "I know." "Considering the alternative, I know," she said again. She was watching the cattle at the spring, the way they pressed together at the water, the change in their bodies as the immediate desperation eased. "We need to talk to people about rotation. Nobody should try to keep their full herd here. The second spring is another mile east. We need to assess whether it's better to split the herds now or in sequence." "Mara." His voice had a different quality. She looked at him. "It worked," he said. "It's working," she said. "We're not done." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd come to recognize as Colt Mercer, working out something he wanted to say and finding the right words for it, which was always a slower process than most people expected from him. "You know what I mean." She did know what he meant. She just wasn't ready to receive it, standing on a mountain with sore arms and dirty clothes, and the second spring still unaccounted for. She would receive it later, when there was room for it. "Go talk to Dorset," she said. "He lost a steer and he needs someone to talk to him like it matters. He'll be useful to us if he doesn't feel invisible." Colt looked at her another moment. Then he went to find Dorset. The second spring was in better shape than she'd feared. The storm had deposited debris around the inlet, but the water source itself was unaffected, running clean and cold from the same formation that fed the first. She took Garrett and one of the Garver sons up to assess it that afternoon while the others rested, and they came back with confirmation that it could support the overflow from the first. The logistics of the next 2 weeks took shape around the springs in the way that practical necessity shapes things when there are enough capable people working together. Not elegantly, not without argument, but functionally. Rotation schedules were worked out around the limitations of the trail and the capacity of the water sources. Families that hadn't been part of the initial drive sent word up that they were coming, and Mara sent word back about the trail with the specificity of someone who had been wrong about an estimate once and was not going to be wrong again. Dorset approached her on the second day. He waited until Colt was working with the Dunnett brothers on the far side of the spring basin, which she thought was deliberate. He was a man who found it easier to say certain things without an audience. He stood near her for a moment before speaking, which she'd learned was his way of working up to something. "I want to tell you," he said, "that pulling my cooperation this past spring was a mistake." She kept her eyes on the cattle rotation she was managing. "You had reasons." "I had pressure," he said. "That's different." She looked at him then. His face was weathered and tired and carrying the particular honest discomfort of a man who has done something he knows was wrong and has decided to say so rather than leave it unsaid. She respected the decision. It was not an easy one to make, especially for a man like Dorset, whose social standing depended on never visibly backing down. "The road access," she said. "Is it still off?" "No," he said. "It's not." She nodded. "Then we're square." He looked slightly surprised at the brevity of it, as if he'd expected more to be asked. "That's all?" "What else would I want?" she said. You're here. Your cattle are drinking. We need your cooperation for the rotation schedule going forward more than we need a longer conversation about the past. He was quiet for a moment. My daughter asked about you, he said unexpectedly. She's 12. She heard what you did. The map, the trail. She wants to know how you knew about the springs. Something shifted slightly in Mara's chest. Tell her I walked up here when I was not much older than she is, because I wanted to know what was above the ridge, and I kept coming back. Dorset looked at her for a moment. I'll tell her that, he said, and walked back to his cattle. 10. The County Water Authority response arrived on the 22nd of August. A letter delivered to the general store addressed to Dale Aldrin, who had been the named petitioner. By that point, the valley's cattle had been rotating through the mountain springs for 11 days, and the losses that had looked catastrophic in the worst week of the drought had been contained to numbers that most of the ranching families could absorb. Mara heard about the letter from Cal Dunnett, who heard it from his cousin, who worked the store. The letter confirmed that the county's emergency water allocation process would take a minimum of 6 additional weeks and was subject to review. By which point, as Mara had calculated in June and said out loud at the Fuller gathering, the damage would have been done. She said nothing about the letter publicly. She did not need to. What happened instead was quieter and more durable than any argument she could have made. It happened in the way that truth tends to establish itself in small communities, not through announcement, but through the accumulation of undeniable fact. Families that had lost cattle during the worst of the drought began adding up what they still had and what they would have lost without the springs. Ranchers who had managed to hold their herds through the rotation started talking to neighbors who hadn't been part of the initial drive, and those conversations had a quality that was different from the social noise of the past months. They were specific, numerical, the language of people describing outcomes rather than opinions. Nobody was making speeches. Nobody was publicly reversing a position. The reversal was happening in the mathematics of survival, which were harder to argue with than anything Mara could have said. On a Thursday afternoon in late August, she was coming out of the general store with supplies when Patrice Aldrin stopped her on the steps. This was unexpected. Patrice had spent months being the social atmosphere through which the town's hostility toward Mara moved. Not always directly, but consistently, the way certain people managed to be present in a thing without ever appearing to have caused it. She stood on the step above Mara, which may or may not have been intentional, and she looked at her with an expression that was working to be something it wasn't quite. I hear the rotation schedule is working, Patrice said. So far. Dale says, she stopped, started again. The Foster's herd is doing better than expected. They got to the second spring early, good timing. A pause. Patrice looked at something past Mara's shoulder, then back. You did a thing, she said, and it came out awkwardly, without the social smoothness she usually managed, which made it more genuine than anything polished would have been. I won't pretend I expected it. Mara looked at her. I know you won't. She stepped down past Patrice and walked to her horse, and she heard the older woman standing on the step behind her in silence, and she did not feel triumphant, and she did not feel bitter. She felt something more complicated and more true. The feeling of a person who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has not yet put it down, but has started to believe for the first time in years that putting it down might eventually be possible. She rode home in the late afternoon heat through a valley that was still dry and still difficult and still hers, and she thought about the Dorset girl who wanted to know how you learned the land. She thought about Thomas at the water's edge with his face in his hands. She thought about the 2 cattle they had lost on the shale section and about the ones that were still alive. The trail existed. The water was real. The rest of it would have to work itself out the way things did, slowly, imperfectly, with some people coming around and some people not. That was enough. For now, that was enough. September arrived the way recovery always does. Not with fanfare, not with a clean line between the hard time and the easier one, but gradually, in small accumulating signs that you only recognized as a pattern after enough of them had stacked up. The first rain came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the initial drive to the springs. It was not a dramatic rain. No thunder, no lightning show, just a steady gray drizzle that started in the early morning and continued through the afternoon without committing to anything heavier. The kind of rain that in a normal year would have been unremarkable. And this year it brought people out of their houses to stand on their porches and look up at the sky with expressions that had no good word in the English language, something between relief and disbelief and a grief that was only now safe enough to feel. Mara stood at the barn door and watched the rain come down on the dry yard and felt it soak into the cracked ground in slow dark patches. She stayed there longer than was practical. Colt came and stood beside her after a while, and neither of them said anything for several minutes. "The South Creek will take another week to recover," she finally said. "Probably 2. The rotation needs to run another 3 weeks minimum. Even after the creek recovers, the first spring should stay accessible. We should mark the trail permanently." He looked at her sideways. "Already thinking about next time." "Someone should." He was quiet for a moment. "Thomas asked me this morning if there was permanent work." She had expected this and was glad for it. "He earned it." "I told him yes." Colt paused. "He cried a little. Tried not to show it." "I know. He does that." She thought about the boy at the water's edge on the mountain, face in his hands. 17 years old with nowhere to go, who had stayed and worked and pushed cattle up a rocky trail because it was the only option available to him, and had turned out to be exactly the kind of person a place needed without knowing it in advance. Good. The rain kept falling. Somewhere across the valley, a ranching family she couldn't see was standing at their own door watching the same sky, and the fact that their cattle were mostly alive to need water was a thing that had happened because of a map drawn from memory and a trail cut by a woman the town had dismissed. She did not think about that with pride exactly, more with a specific tired satisfaction, the feeling of a thing finally landing where it was always meant to. The survey dispute was resolved in the 3rd week of September. The county land office, presented with 2 competing surveys, had appointed a third-party examiner whose finding was delivered in the flat, bureaucratic language of official documents. The original Mercer survey boundaries were confirmed. The challenge was dismissed. The water allocation stood. Mara read the letter twice and handed it to Colt and went back to the morning work. He folded it and put it in the document box where they kept the ranch's legal papers. "That's done," he said. "That part," she said. She meant it practically. There was still the legal cost to account for, still the relationship with the Dorset Road to formally restore, still the business contracts that had been pulled and would need to be rebuilt through the slow process of demonstrated reliability. The survey ruling closed one chapter, but it did not close the book. That was not how these things worked. What did happen, though, was that the ruling removed the last structural argument against the Mercer Ranch's position in the valley. The social pressure that Aldrin had been applying through the spring and summer had depended partly on the idea that Colt's choice had made him genuinely vulnerable, not just unpopular, but legally and financially exposed. The survey dismissal made that argument harder to maintain, and Aldrin was a practical man under everything else. Practical men, in Mara's experience, knew when a campaign had run past its useful life. She did not expect an apology from Dale Aldrin. She was not going to receive one, and she knew it. What she expected, and what she got, was the slow withdrawal of active opposition, a gradual cessation of the specific subtle pressures that had made the past months difficult. The Whisper campaign did not end on a date. It simply thinned, the way a fire thins when you stop adding to it, until one day you notice that the temperature in the room has changed, and you can't point to the exact moment it happened. She knew, because Clara told her. Clara still went to the general store and had the particular social intelligence of a woman who had been observing a community for 30 years. That what had shifted the conversation was not the survey ruling and not any single dramatic moment, but the rotation schedule, the fact of it. The physical, countable, undeniable fact that families who had participated in the Mountain Spring rotation had come through the drought with significantly better losses than those who hadn't, and that everyone in the valley could see the numbers, and the numbers had an author. "Patrice Aldrin," Clara said one evening, setting her mending in her lap, "told Margaret Fuller that you were resourceful." Mara looked at her mother. "Resourceful. That was the word? Not brilliant, not right, resourceful." "It's Patrice Aldrin," Clara said. "Resourceful is a concession." Mara thought about that for a moment. Then she laughed. A real laugh, short and dry and genuine. "Fair enough." It was Walt Briggs who said it plainly. Because Walt had always been the person in Red Hollow who said things plainly when the moment required it. He came to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon in early October, riding slowly on account of his hands, and Mara met him at the fence and walked with him to the porch, and they sat with coffee that she had made too strong, the way he liked it, and he looked out at the valley for a while before he spoke. "I've been ranching this land for 34 years, he said. Seen 3 bad droughts. 2 that were near as bad as this one that was worse. He held the cup in both hands the way he did when his joints were bothering him. We lost more cattle in those 2 near bad ones than we lost this summer. You know why? Walt, because nobody knew about those springs, or if they did, nobody had the sense to think it through in advance and build the trail before they needed it. He looked at her. You had the sense, and you had the patience to build it when nobody was asking you to. She looked at her coffee cup. I've always had trouble sleeping. That's not what I'm talking about, and you know it. His voice was not sharp. It was the voice of an old man who has spent a long time figuring out which things needed saying and was not going to be deflected now. I'm talking about what you did this year, all of it. Not just the springs, the way you handled the whole of it, the pressure, the loss of the hands, the survey business. Most people would have gotten small. She was quiet for a moment. Some days I did get small. But you came back the next day. There was work to do. That's what I mean, Walt said. That's exactly what I mean. They sat for a while without talking, which was comfortable in the way that conversations with Walt had always been comfortable. He was not a man who required noise. The Dorset girl, Mara said finally. Dorset told me she wanted to know about the springs, how I found them. Louise, Walt nodded. Sharp kid, reads everything she can get her hands on. I was thinking about maybe... She stopped, because this was a thought she had been having for a while and had not said out loud to anyone yet, not even Colt, and saying it felt like committing to something. There's more to this valley than anyone's mapped properly. The springs are one thing, but the watershed above the North Ridge, the way the weather moves through the gap between the second and third peaks, if someone took the time to document it correctly, built on it, taught it. Walt was smiling. It was a slow smile, the kind that came from seeing something confirm a long-held belief. You thinking about teaching? He said. I'm thinking about the next drought, she said, which will come. Maybe 5 years, maybe 10. And when it does, I'd rather the valley have 3 people who know what I know than just me. Walt nodded. Start with Louise Dorset. She'll be a good one. October settled over Red Hollow the way it always did. The cold returning in earnest, the light going gold and thin, the work shifting from the desperate improvisation of crisis to the slower necessary labor of preparing for winter. Fences reinforced, feed stored. The cattle that had survived the summer assessed and tallied. Mara walked the Mercer property in the late afternoons sometimes, not for any specific purpose, just moving through the land the way she had always moved through land, paying attention, noticing, the habit that had begun when she was young and had never fully explained itself to her, but had turned out to matter more than almost anything else she'd learned. She noticed the grass coming back in the south pasture, slow and tentative at first, then with more confidence as the September rains accumulated. She noticed where the fence repairs from the summer's sabotage had been done right, and where they'd been done quickly and would need revisiting. She noticed the places along the creek banks where the water was returning, the channel reestablishing itself by instinct through the landscape that had always held its shape. She thought, walking, about what Walt had said, about getting small. There had been days, more than she'd admitted to anyone, when the accumulated weight of the town's rejection had pressed down on her with a specific heaviness that was hard to describe to someone who hadn't felt it. Not just the cruelty itself, but the way cruelty over a long period starts to feel like information, starts to feel like truth. She was 31 years old, and she had spent roughly 20 of those years being told, in various explicit and implicit ways, that the shape of her life and the shape of her body and the shape of her social position were things that disqualified her from certain kinds of belonging. The thing about that kind of long, slow, consistent message is that you absorb it even when you're resisting it. You absorb it the way the ground absorbs water. It goes into you, and you carry it whether you intend to or not. She had thought for years that the answer to it was to be useful, to help the people who would not fully accept her, to build a competence so undeniable that the rejection would eventually become logically inconsistent. She had not thought of it in those words, but that was the strategy, running quietly under everything she did. What she had not anticipated, and what the past year had taught her, was that the strategy worked, but not in the way she'd expected. The town's opinion of her had shifted. That was real. But the shift had not changed the fundamental thing, which was this. She had always known the springs. She had always known the land. The knowledge had existed in her before anyone asked for it, and it would have existed in her if no one had ever asked for it, and it would have continued to exist in her if the drought had never come and the town had never needed her. She had been worth something all along, not because she had eventually proven it, but because she had always been it. The town's recognition was not the thing that made it true. It was just the town finally catching up. She was not sure exactly when she had understood this. It had arrived not as a revelation, but as a slow certainty, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but that you discover has been there for a while when you finally go looking. Colt found her at the south fence on one of those October afternoons, coming up on horseback from the direction of the lower pasture. He climbed down and tied the horse to the post, and came to stand beside her, and they stood looking out over the recovering valley together, the way they had stood at the barn door watching the September rain. "Got a letter from Brennan," he said. Brennan was the cattle broker who had pulled the supply contract in the spring. "He wants to reopen the arrangement." "What did you say?" "Nothing yet." He looked at her. "What would you say?" She thought about it. "I'd say he can have the contract at the same terms as before, and I'd say we expect him to be reliable when it's inconvenient, not just when it's easy." Colt nodded slowly. "That's what I'd say too." "Then write that." He was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light came flat and golden across the fence posts, and the south pasture grass was thin but green again, and the creek in the distance was running low but running. "Dorset's son came by yesterday," Colt said, "while you were up on the ridge." "What did he want?" "He wanted to know if we'd be willing to share the spring access as a formal arrangement, a kind of cooperative agreement for emergency situations. Him, Garrett, the Pattons, maybe 2 or 3 others." He paused. He said it was his father's idea. She looked at the fence line, at the post she'd replaced herself in March, before any of this had started. It was solid. The concrete around the base had cured well. "Yes," she said. "Just yes?" "What else would I say? That's how it should work." She turned and started walking back toward the barn. "Write up terms that are fair, not generous. Fair. They should contribute labor to trail maintenance in proportion to what they use. That's all I want from it." Colt walked beside her. After a moment, he said, "You're not going to enjoy this even a little?" She glanced at him. "Enjoy what?" "The part where the people who spent a year making things difficult for us are now coming to us for a cooperative agreement." She thought about that honestly, because she was not the kind of person who pretended not to feel things for the sake of appearing above them. She did feel something. Not satisfaction exactly, more a kind of worn, complicated vindication that was hard to separate from the exhaustion that had built up beside it. "A little," she said, "but not as much as I thought I would." "What do you feel instead?" She pushed open the barn door and let them both in out of the wind. "Tired," she said, "and like there's a lot of work still to do." He stopped her with a hand on her arm, though not urgently, just enough. She turned and looked at him, and he looked at her with the direct, unhurried attention that she had come to understand was simply how Colt Mercer looked at things he valued. "I need to say something," he said. "All right." "I knew what I was doing in March, when I stood up in front of the town." He said it without preamble, the way he did most things. "I knew it was going to cost something. I'd thought through it. You should know that." "I know that, Colt." "What I didn't know—" He stopped, the way he sometimes did when the words were taking longer than the thought. "What I couldn't have known was what the year was going to ask from you specifically, the way it was going to go. And I need you to know that if it had gone the other way, if the plan hadn't worked, if the springs had been dry, if the whole thing had come apart, it would not have changed anything from my side." She looked at him steadily. "I know that too." "Then why do you look like you're waiting for something?" "I'm not waiting," she said, and realized that was true. She was not waiting for the town's approval or his reassurance or the resolution of the survey or the comeback of the cattle broker or any of the things she had spent a long time bracing herself around. All of those things had happened or were happening or would happen the way things happened, imperfectly, gradually, without fanfare. "I'm just here." He looked at her for a moment longer, then he nodded, the way he nodded when a thing made sense, and let go of her arm, and they both went to work. The Cooperative Spring Agreement was signed by 6 families before November. Louise Dorset came to the ranch for the first time in late October, the 12-year-old girl with her father's quietness and her own specific alertness in her eyes, and Mara took her up to the ridge, not all the way, just to the first bench, and showed her how to read the terrain, how to look at the way water moved through a landscape and left evidence of its patterns. The girl was quiet and asked good questions, and had the particular quality of attention that Mara recognized from looking in the mirror for 31 years. "How long did it take you to learn all of this?" Louise asked at the bench, looking out across the valley below. "I'm still learning it," Mara said. "That's the thing. You never finish. You just get further along." Louise looked out across the valley, then back at Mara. "My ma says you saved the valley." Mara thought about all of the things she could say to that. The accurate, complicated, honest version of events that involved other people's labor and 2 cattle lost on the shale, and 4 weeks of bad sleep and a husband who stood beside her in a crowd, and the Dunnett brothers who told her what they knew, and Walt Briggs who came and said the things that needed saying. "A lot of people saved the valley," she said. "I just knew where the water was." "But you were the only one who knew," Louise said. "Yes," Mara said, "I was." She looked at the girl beside her. "That's why you should learn it too. So next time it's not just one person." They came down off the ridge in the late afternoon, the 12-year-old girl and the woman who had spent 20 years learning a valley that had spent 20 years not quite looking back at her. And the light came low and golden across the hills that Mara had walked since she was younger than Louise. And below them the town of Red Hollow sat in the plain flat way of frontier towns, ordinary and imperfect and hers. Not hers because it had accepted her, not hers because she had proven something to it, hers because she had stayed and worked and paid attention and built the knowledge in the long years before it mattered, in the quiet time before anyone was watching. That was the thing, in the end, the thing she would have said if anyone had asked her directly how a person who had spent 30 years being overlooked managed to become, in one brutal summer, the person the valley turned to. She would have said, "It is not a thing you become. It is a thing you always were." And the only difference between before and after is that the circumstances finally got hard enough that the truth could not be ignored. The town of Red Hollow would go on being what it was. Some people would carry their old opinions into the winter and beyond. Patrice Aldrin would find new subjects for her social assessments. Dale Aldrin would recalibrate his approach to the valley's next crisis and not credit Mara for the one that had passed. That was human nature, and she had stopped expecting better of it. But Louise Dorset would know the ridge by spring, and Thomas would work the ranch into the next decade, growing from a boy with nowhere to go into a man who had found the specific ground where his competence lived. And Ellen Patton, who had gotten off her horse in the middle of a shale section to hold a struggling animal's head still, would carry the memory of what it looked like when a woman made a decision and stood by it. And Walt Briggs, in whatever years he had left, would tell people the accurate version of what had happened. Not the inflated legend, not the diminished gossip, but the plain true story of a woman who had mapped the high country and built the trail before it was needed, and then had led the valley up it when the time came. Mara Boone, who had been told for a very long time that she was too much and not enough, who had decided somewhere in the long, quiet middle of an ordinary life that the land was worth knowing and the work was worth doing and the people around her were worth helping, regardless of whether they were going to deserve it. She had not been wrong. She walked the last stretch of trail beside a 12-year-old girl in the October light, and she was tired and her arm still ached where the cattle hoof had caught her 6 weeks ago. And she had a fence on the eastern property that needed work before the real cold came. And the coffee at home was going to be strong because it was always strong. She walked into all of it without hesitation. That was enough. It had always been enough.